All right, we've looked at the Western Church through the 8th century. Now let's turn our attention to the Eastern Church and see what we can learn about the eastern half of Christendom. First of all, I want to explain what the map looks like. This is a division of East and West according to the dioceses of the Western Empire and Eastern Empire. We've already talked about the West. Of course, it's still centered in Rome, but just north is the Diocese of Italy, the Diocese of Gaul, and then Britain. Here's the Diocese of Spain and the Diocese of Africa. All right, notice then the Eastern dioceses. Of course, the capital is Constantinople in the Diocese of Thrace. The Diocese of Dacia is just to the west, and to the south is the Diocese of Macedonia. And then here's Asia, Pontus, the Diocese of the East, which includes Jerusalem and Antioch, and the Diocese of Egypt, headed, of course, by the great church in Alexandria. So this kind of gives you an idea of the map and the division between the Western Church and the Eastern Church. We will talk more later about the cultural and ecclesiastical differences between the Western Church and the Eastern Church. But let's look at some of the political differences between the two. All right, first of all, we no longer refer to the Eastern Empire as the Roman Empire. Obviously, Rome is no longer a part of the remainder of the empire in the East. Remember that Constantine built his city, Constantinople, on top of the Latin city Byzantium. And so, historians refer to the Eastern Empire as the Byzantine Empire. And the Byzantine Empire endured intact until the 7th century, as opposed to the fall of Rome and the absence of imperial leadership in the West. In actuality, the Eastern Empire existed in some form into the 15th century, but it was in the 7th century that Islam began to encroach upon the territory of the Byzantine Empire. Now, because the Eastern Empire remained intact, Constantinople still the capital and the headquarters of the Eastern Emperor, the Eastern emperors exercised authority in the East, even higher than the authority of the Patriarch of Constantinople. Remember that even the very weak emperor, Arcadius, exercised control over John Chrysostom to the extent that he could send him into exile and death. But of course, in the West, without the presence of an emperor, the Bishop of Rome then becomes a much more powerful figure. Now, the conflicts that we observed in the earlier councils demonstrate the theological disunity and the political rivalry between Alexandria and Antioch. And these conflicts did not go away, even though the councils had decided for Nicene and Chalcedonian orthodoxy. The Eastern churches still had to deal with Nestorianism, this idea that Christ was in two persons. They had to deal with monophysitism, the idea that Christ had only one nature. These were two very opposite Christologies. Chalcedon, on the other hand, affirmed the Orthodox Christology that Jesus is one person with two natures. So these three theologies continue to contradict and conflict with each other in spite of the Chalcedonian definition. Now, there were 13 bishoprics in the East, as we have already observed. Constantinople was considered the first among equals, whereas in the West, as we've said, Rome dominated. Now, the Persians to the east threatened invasion of the Eastern Empire. Barbarians from the north continued to threaten the Eastern Empire. Therefore, there was a great need for religious unity. So again, the emperor desired to use Christianity as a cement to hold his empire together. In 429, the Vandals swept all the way across from east to the west, going south through Spain into North Africa, where they settled for a century. From 429, they moved into North Africa, bringing Arianism into the region, and they remained in power for over a century until Justinian arose to become one of the most powerful Eastern emperors. You see the dates of his rule from 527 to 565. In 533, his general Belisarius defeated the Vandals at Carthage, and so he returned Orthodox Christianity to North Africa. Then his armies invaded Italy and defeated the Ostrogoths, and therefore Belisarius, under the rule of Justinian, established a Byzantine presence in Italy. All right, this was both good in that the Eastern imperial forces could defend orthodoxy against the barbarians, but at the same time, the Bishop of Rome resented the presence of the Eastern emperor, and through him, the Eastern patriarchs, their influence and interference in his rule in Italy. Now, Justinian, recognizing the need for religious unity in the East, convened a second council in Constantinople in order to deal with the conflict between Chalcedonian Orthodoxy and the monophysitism that still thrived in the East. All right, so following Chalcedon, many Alexandrian Christians were dissatisfied with the definition of Christ as having two natures, because to them, having two natures indicated two persons. And you'll remember that Eutyches, speaking for Alexandrian theology, said that Christ had two natures at the beginning, but the human nature was overwhelmed by the divine nature like a drop of honey in the ocean. All right, so we call this theology monophysitism, or one nature. So, at the Second Council of Constantinople, the Chalcedonian definition was revised in line with Cyril's Alexandrian view of the mystical union of the divine and human in the nature of Christ. So, in my opinion, and reflecting Chalcedonian orthodoxy, the Second Council of Constantinople is the only one that got it wrong, because it concluded that Jesus had only one nature, which is not biblical orthodoxy. After the Second Council of Constantinople, the debate shifted from Jesus' nature to his will. And so there was the idea that perhaps Jesus had one nature but two wills. And so there was a debate between the monothelites, those who supported one will, the divine will, versus the duothelites, who said there were two wills, divine and human. Okay, so the monothelites agreed to two natures, but they said there was only one divine will in Christ. The duothelites claimed that two natures meant two wills, and so we have a similar discussion to the one we had under Apollinaris, where the idea is that if Christ did not assume the human will, then all of humanity could not have been saved. All right, the Third Council of Constantinople was called in 680, and the conclusion there is that this council reaffirmed Chalcedonian definition that Christ has two distinct natures. It amended the formula to include that there were two natural wills not opposed to each other. The human will follows the divine will and is subject to it. So, the conclusion of the Third Council of Constantinople returned the church to Chalcedonian orthodoxy. But the Nestorians and the Monophysites continued to congregate and to worship separately from the Nicene Chalcedonian church. The Orthodox church in the East, in union with the Eastern Empire, persecuted these sects. And so a century later, when the Muslims invaded these territories, these sectarians, the Nestorians and Monophysites, actually decided to take their chances with the Muslims instead of the Orthodox Christians. They thought that perhaps the Muslims would treat them better than the Eastern Orthodox did. And so we do have a tentative solution to the theological disputes in the East, but nonetheless not a complete solution. Well, the next council deals with an entirely different debate. And this is the debate over the use of icons or images in worship. Now, remember that largely those who attend church are illiterate, so they cannot read the scriptures. Icons, then, these images, are used to edify and educate those who attend the church. These icons were ornate, beautifully detailed pictures that teach people about Jesus, about the apostles, about the martyrs, about the church in general. But as the images began to proliferate in the churches, the people began to see in the icons not only the images, but even the reality of what they represent. And so those who attend church, seeing the icons, they tend to worship the icons themselves, which borders on idolatry. And so there creates a debate between those who support the use of icons and those who are opposed. All right, on one side we have the iconodules, the icon kissers. All right? They taught that the incarnation meant that the divine was joined to the human, and therefore the divine should be represented in visual art. Do you catch that? They're using the incarnation as a justification for artwork, human artwork. The iconoclasts were the icon smashers. They disapproved of any visual art depicting Jesus. They taught that images are idolatrous, particularly in the way that the worshipers are using them. And at the same time, as Islam begins to overtake this eastern region, the Christians observe that Muslims condemn any depictions of God or any images, and so the use of images in the churches impedes the possibility of converting the Muslims to Christianity. All right, so we have these two sides, the icon kissers and the icon smashers, that are in conflict with each other. The Empress Regent at the time was named Irene, meaning peace. Not that there was much peace at this time, but she favored icons, and so she called a council at Nicaea in 787. Of course, this is known as the Second Council of Nicaea. The conclusion was that icons are allowed in worship to affirm the incarnation of Christ. Christ was willing to take on human form. Therefore, worship can be presented in human art. People are allowed to bow down before icons and to kiss icons, but they are not allowed to worship icons. Are you scratching your head? I am not sure that I understand the distinction between bowing down before an icon, kissing an icon, but not worshiping an icon. Worshiping of icons was forbidden. Worship was to be bestowed on God alone. Well, amen to that. And although I support the use of icons in educating the church, nonetheless, I am troubled when I read that in this period of the church, people were bowing down and kissing icons. Now, both the Western and Eastern churches accept the ruling of Nicaea II, and they agree to the use of icons in the church, but still there are different interpretations between the East and the West. In the East, only flat or two-dimensional images were used. They're beautiful, two-dimensional, but in the West, sculpture was allowed. So in Western churches, if you visit Rome or London, Paris, you'll find sculptures in the churches. But in the Eastern churches, you see only flat two-dimensional images, either in icons, like the one illustrated here, or they actually will paint icons on the walls of their churches. But ultimately, this difference between flat icons and sculpture increased the tensions between the East and the West. Now, with your permission, I would like to share with you some of the icons that I have collected on my various journeys into Jerusalem and in Greece, and even in Turkey. And so these are on a shelf in my office, and when I am in the classroom, I will often bring these into the classroom and pass them around. But let me share them with you as best I can through images on slides. All right, this is a smiling Madonna that I've seen in the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem. It's difficult to see in my photograph, but it is made of silver and gold. It is quite sumptuous. It was given to the Church of the Nativity by the Russian Orthodox Church. Smiling Madonnas are quite rare. Most of the time, Mary is shown to be very austere, but there is a common motif that is seen occasionally of the smiling Madonna. Notice in this picture that Jesus is shown with almost an adult face, and this was a common representation of Jesus, demonstrating his wisdom. Though he was a child, still he was omniscient. Well, here is my very small version of the smiling Madonna. I purchased this in Jerusalem, and so even though it's a small icon, I'm very glad to have it in my collection. Now here is another icon of Mary and the Nativity. This one is more ornate. Notice, of course, Mary is in the center, worshiping Jesus, again with an adult face, but there they are in the cave. And by the way, I have seen the original of this icon, again, in the Church of the Nativity. It is displayed just outside the stairs that take one down to the manger and the place where the shepherds worship Jesus. All right, notice the educational ideas. Here's a star at the top, but notice that it points like a spear, like the sword that pierced Mary. Here we have angels on one side. We have the three kings that are approaching. Over here we have an angel speaking to the shepherds. Then at the bottom, this is interesting, the bottom left shows Joseph addressing the appearance of doubt appearing as a person, speaking to Joseph and casting doubt upon him. Obviously, he overcomes that doubt. And then this also is interesting in the lower right. Here are midwives. We certainly don't read about them in the biblical story, but it's important that the midwives are there washing the baby Jesus of the blood that comes from natural childbirth. All right, and this would be in opposition to current ideas that Jesus was not born naturally, but was actually transported supernaturally out of Mary's womb. Again, I have my own copy of this. This was purchased in a shop just outside the Church of the Nativity. It is not an expensive copy by any means, but nonetheless, it is part of my collection. The next icon that I want to show you was given to me by my friend Jim Parker, who purchased it at Meteora, Greece, where they actually paint icons. And this one, of course, is of the Last Supper. As I studied this icon, I found it interesting for a couple of reasons. Number one, do you see the Apostle John, leaning upon Jesus at the Last Supper. But let's count the number of people that surround the table. All right, we have Jesus, and then we can count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. Why 13? Who is the extra person? Can you look and see who perhaps is not one of the disciples? Well, look over here, the person dressed in red, peeking in through the window. This is Satan, who is peeking in to tempt Judas to fulfill the betrayal of the Lord Jesus Christ. So again, you can see how educational icons can be. All right, next, this is one of my favorites. There we go. Here is the one that I bought at Meteora when I visited that shop. I chose it because I was speaking that day about a devotional that I drew from the story of the transformation of Christ. All right, notice in the picture on the slide that Christ is on the Mount of Transfiguration. He's surrounded by blue. Blue is the color of heaven. And at the Mount of Transfiguration, heaven is shining through Christ's human presence to reveal to the disciples his divinity. On one side is Moses. On the other side is Elijah. And beneath we see the three disciples in differing stages of cowering. We see the Apostle Peter asking if he should build a tent for the three of them. All right, the Mount of Transfiguration. Also at Meteora, I purchased an icon of the resurrection, perhaps my favorite. I think I've already said the Mount of Transfiguration is my favorite, so obviously I appreciate both of these very much. Again, we see the blue heavenly colors behind Jesus, and on one side we see the two kings, David and Solomon. We see John the Baptist. On the other side we see the prophets, probably Jeremiah and Isaiah, perhaps Moses, that are accompanying him. Notice that he is victorious over death and Hades. But who are these two figures that he is bringing out of their coffins? Male and female. Who do they represent? Adam and Eve, our foreparents, and they represent the resurrection of all humanity through their faith in Jesus Christ. All right, here it is in my hand, a smaller version of this beautiful icon of the resurrection. Next, I want to tell you about my trip to the island of Patmos. And while there, we visited the cave where allegedly John received his great revelation. In fact, you can see over to the side a ledge where supposedly he took the dictation and wrote down the vision. So this is John's cave on the island of Patmos. Now look in the back on the wall. There is an icon that describes the experience that John had. Here's a close-up of the icon, and you see at the bottom, here's John having his dream, and he sees Jesus Jesus holds the 7 stars in his right hand. He holds the keys of the kingdom. Out of his mouth is the two-edged sword. He's surrounded by the angels and the churches. And then at his feet are the 7 lampstands representing the 7 churches. Again, in Patmos, I purchased an inexpensive but very nice replica of this icon. They wouldn't let me take pictures, and so I had to bring a copy of the icon home with me. Now, this is the most recent addition to my collection, and again, it was brought to me by my dear friend Jim, who recently went to Greece again and traveled to Metaora. And thinking of me, he bought an icon of the Apostle Paul, thinking that in particular he wanted an icon of a martyr. And the painter was finishing this up and pointed out that Paul indeed was a martyr, as we have discussed. He was beheaded in Rome under the persecution of Nero. You can see the word apostle here, the name Paulus here in very small print describes him as an apostle to the Gentiles, and the artist even signed his name. Thank you so much for your patience as I walked you through my collection of icons. You'll not be tested on these, but I just wanted to share with you some of the wealth of my travels. I'm so grateful that I've had opportunities to travel to so many places, and these icons are very nice mementos of the places that I've gone to, and they enhance my own education, and I hope they have enhanced yours as well. So God's blessings to you as we wrap up our study of the Eastern Church, having already looked at the Western Church. We will continue to make our way through the medieval era of the church as we continue our study together.